Oh, hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Hartigan again, and I'm going to continue reading Kittens in the Kitchen. When we last ended, James and Mandy and her friend James, had just finished their school day and headed to the custodian's house, which was behind the school, and they were hoping to find the kittens in the little bed that they had made. But when they got up to the porch, they discovered that Walton wasn't there. So we're going to find out, we're going to continue on and find out where is Walton and the kittens. So I'm going to repeat a little bit of what I started reading, what I read at the end last time. So we're going to start here. Mandy shook her head. It's today. I'm sure it's today. She couldn't understand it. She'd seen enough cats giving birth to kittens at Animal Ark to know just how they looked when the great day came. Mandy and James stood on the porch, confused and alarmed. Listen, Mandy said. The Williamses' back door stood open in the afternoon sunshine, and Mandy was sure she'd picked up a sound from inside, a tiny, high-pitched squeaking sound. James stared at her. What is it? Mandy stepped across the kitchen threshold. Mr. Williams, she whispered. Mrs. Williams. The kitchen was neat and clean, scrubbed to perfection. Its lace curtains shone pure white. Its black and white tiles looked like an advertisement for floor cleaner. But it was empty. The squeaking noise was slightly louder. In here, Mandy said. They tiptoed into the empty room. It's still very muffled, James said. He looked inside the cupboard, trying to find the noise. They looked under shelves, behind the vegetable bin, but still the noise escaped them. Walton, Mandy called gently. But Walton, wherever she was, didn't want company. Only the muffled, faint squeaking continued. Mandy followed it until she finally tracked it down. There was a laundry basket in the corner of the kitchen, by the washing machine. It was an old-fashioned straw one with a lid. Mandy put her ear to it. The squeaking came from inside. Gingerly she lifted the lid. It was dark and warm in there. The high-pitched noise rose to a wailing chorus. Mandy adjusted her eyes to the darkness and peered aside. She saw the black and white patches of Walton's fur. She saw the cat's eyes glint as she looked up. Obligingly, Walton lifted a paw and shifted sideways. Look, she seemed to be saying, 4 perfect kittens. Mandy could just make them out. 4 tiny curled-up things, gray and blind. Skinny, helpless creatures. She thought they were the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. Aren't they wonderful, Mandy breathed as James came to look over her shoulder. He saw their blunt little faces and blind eyes. Yes, he said. He clearly needed more time to get used to them. Oh, but they are, Mandy cooed. She touched Walton gently under the chin. Good girl, she said. The kittens squeaked louder in protest at the light and cooler air. Mandy gave in and replaced the laundry basket lid. And then their luck ran out. Someone crossed the porch and filled the kitchen doorway. He was tall, bulky, and his feet made a noise across the wooden floor of the porch. Amy, he called. He paused, wiped his feet, and then stepped into the kitchen. Mr. Williams, hello, Mandy said feebly. James stood alongside her, straightening his school tie, trying to look braver than he felt. What the heck, Mr. Williams bellowed with shock. Amy, where are you? What the heck, he said again. His wife came tottering through from the front room. She was slightly deaf, slightly nearsighted. Don't shout, Eric, she sighed. I can hear perfectly well without you having to shout. "Oh, can you?" her husband fumed. "I'll bet you heard these two prowling around here and in here perfectly well, too." Mrs. Williams sighed again. "Sit down, all of you," she said. "Everybody sit down while I make us a cup of tea." It was clearly her cure for everything. Mandy and James sat down as they were told, as far away from Mr. Williams as possible, while his wife made the tea. "Well," he said over and over, "can't a man even call his house his own home any more?" "Oh, shush, Eric," his wife said, giving him his favorite mug and a butter cookie. "Just give them a chance to explain." She was little and skinny, half his size, but Mandy and James could see who was the boss. "Well, then," Mrs. Williams smiled sweetly at Mandy, "I'm sure there's a perfectly good explanation." "There is," Mandy agreed. She looked wildly at James for help. "The cat had kittens," James blurted out. "In your laundry basket," Mandy finished off. "What?" Mr. Williams shot to his feet. He backed off into a corner. "Wait." Mrs. Williams went to investigate. She lifted the basket lid and peered inside. "It has," she confirmed calmly. "It had kittens, all right." "On my best shirts," Mr. Williams stammered. "It had kittens on my best shirts." "Calm down, Eric." Mrs. Williams shook her head. "It's only a stray cat." "Only!" The custodian rolled his eyes in helpless anger. "She won't do any harm," Mandy broke in. "They're very clean animals. She won't leave any mess." She tried to reason with him. "If you just leave her and the kittens there in peace for a few days, they'll soon be on their feet. Then you can make them a better place, a cardboard box, for instance. Just line it with newspaper and put it out on the porch. That should be fine." "A few days," Mr. Williams repeated. His face seemed to be stuck. His mouth had dropped open. His eyes were bulging. Mrs. Williams took Mandy and James aside. She shook her head. "It's no use. He can't stand them." Mandy was slow to catch on. Can't stand what? Only now was she beginning to sense that there was a problem. "Cats. He can't stand them. They set his nerves on edge." Mandy breathed in deeply. How could people hate cats? "He says they dig up his garden. He can't abide them." Mrs. Williams sounded sorry, but she sounded as if they'd just have to understand. Her husband was stubborn as a mule over cats. She turned and started clearing away the tea things. "Just a few days," Mandy said, dashing from one to the other. "We can't move them for a few days in case the mother decides to abandon the kittens. She might if they get moved. Please let her stay where she is." She felt breathless with fright, but she tried not to show it. "Stay in my laundry basket?" Mr. Williams snorted. "On my best shirts?" He tossed his head. "A load of smelly cats?" "They're not," Mandy interrupted, but James stopped her. He had a better idea of when to answer back than Mandy. "Not likely." Mr. Williams headed straight at Mandy and James to shoo them out of his kitchen. "Go on, you two, get moving. I won't warn you again." Mandy and James backed off toward the door. Mr. Williams towered over them. "Please," Mandy pleaded. She felt sick at heart. "No," Mr. Williams thundered. They've got to go." He glanced at his wife. "And there's no use looking like that, Amy. I'm saying no, and I mean no." He looked down at Mandy's terrified face. "I'm telling you once and for all, I'm not having them kittens in my kitchen." Mr. Williams said his final word, then stormed out of the room. Tears sprang to Mandy's eyes. She looked in desperation at Mrs. Williams. The old woman raised her eyebrows and rolled her eyes. She patted her neat gray hair. "Just give him a minute to cool down," she said. She lifted the laundry basket lid to take a peek for herself. My," she murmured. "He can't mean it," Mandy said to James, who was trying to drag her out of the kitchen onto the back porch. He can't just sentence 4 perfectly harmless kittens to death, can he? It isn't fair." James shook his head and kept on pulling. "Come on, we'd better go." "Mrs. Williams," Mandy pleaded. The custodian's wife carefully watched the rose-patterned teacups. She put them away in a high glass-fronted cupboard. "I'm saying nothing," she said steadily. Mandy shook herself free of James. "But it isn't fair. I mean, what have those poor kittens ever done to anybody? They deserve a chance to live just like anyone else. You can't just chuck them away because they happen to have been born in an unusual place." "On top of my husband's best shirts," Mrs. Williams reminded her. "My Eric's very particular about his shirts." She turned to face Mandy, who was a head taller than she, but thin as a piece of string. "Anyhow, whoever said life was fair?" "But if he moves them, they'll die. Walton will abandon them." Again the tears pricked her eyelids. Mrs. Williams stared up at her. "Walton!" She folded her arms and kept her gaze steady. "The mother cat. I called her Walton after the school. I wanted her to sound as if she belonged somewhere, as if she was looked after and had a home and somebody who cared." Mandy rushed on. The tears were rolling down her cheeks now. They ran with a salty taste into her mouth. She remembered the half-starved cat being dumped in the school doorway. She thought to herself, what would have happened to her if Emily and Adam Hope hadn't taken her in and cared for her when she was tiny? "Mandy," James whispered, "don't cry. You'll see worse things than this at Ark every day of the week, remember?" "No, let her alone," Mrs. Williams said thoughtfully. "She's right. They deserve a chance." She took Mandy by the hand and sat her down at the table. Late afternoon sun filtered through the white net curtains. "But for goodness sake, dry your eyes, young woman. I can hear my Eric coming back across the yard, and he can't abide waterworks." She pulled a clean handkerchief out of her apron pocket and handed it to Mandy. "Quick, blow your nose." "Will you help us?" Mandy whispered. The custodian's big boots tramped up the steps and across the porch. "If you let the kittens stay, I'll come here every day, twice a day, to help look after them. I'll—" "Shush," Mrs. Williams warned. Her husband hung his cap on the door peg. She stood up and leaned forward evenly, with clenched fists down on the table. "What the—" Mr. Williams darkened as he caught sight of Mandy and James. "I thought I told you to clear out. What's the matter? Are you deaf?" "Now, Eric," Mrs. Williams began steadily. "Don't you now Eric me." "Now, Eric," she insisted. "This young girl has been explaining to me again about these kittens being moved. It seems the mother won't have any more to do with them if we interfere. They have to be left alone." A loud meow of agreement from inside the baskets backed up the end of Mrs. Williams' firm speech. Thin squeaks followed after in a kind of chorus. Mr. Williams paced up and down the kitchen. "Stand still, Eric, and listen." Hands on hips, the tiny woman in the flowery apron confronted her heavyweight husband. "Where's the harm in it? You've got a drawer full of shirts up those stairs, most of them hardly worn. There's even one still in its package, pins and all. The one your sister gave you last Christmas." She eyed him sternly. "You know I don't like shirts straight from the wrapping," he grumbled. "They're stiff and they itch." "I'll wash it." She didn't flinch. "Then you can wear it this Sunday to church, all right?" Mandy held her breath. She had the good sense not to interfere in this argument, even though the little wailing sounds from inside the basket was tugging at her heartstrings. James stood still sentry by the door, ready to escape. Mr. Williams pointed an accusing finger at the basket. "My best blue shirt, my favorite," he reminded her angrily. But it was the last trace of resistance. He knew when he was beaten. "Now, Eric, it won't come to any harm. This young girl knows all about animals, don't you?" Mandy nodded and gasped. My mother and dad are both vets in Welford at Animal Ark. Mrs. Williams nodded too. See, she's a good girl. She's promised to come here twice a day to help look after these poor little things. They won't get under your feet. They'll just stay in there nice and cozy while Walton tends them. Walton, Mr. Williams interrupted, looking curiously at Mandy. The mother cat, Mrs. Williams said, steady as ever. Crazy name for a cat, he grumbled, but he was definitely weakening. Well, the fierce little woman demanded. Well, he scratched his lined forehead with broad, work-worn fingers. All right, that's settled, she said, like a suitcase snapping shut. The girl will come in here each day until the kittens can begin to fend for themselves. Mr. Williams grunted. That means yes, she reported to Mandy and James. Okay, we're going to stop for now, but I will join you again next week.